Time to talk about everyone's favorite topic, politics. But no, don't worry, I'm not taking a side here. We're not going to talk about policies or anything like that. We're going to take a look at this whole thing from a macro view because that's what we do at Macro Ops, right? So we're going to take a step back and put it all into perspective. So we're going to talk about how politics works from macro view, who's likely to win, and what's likely going to happen after they win. And if you want to put your political opinions down in the comments, go for it. I might read them, but I probably won't. But it does help the YouTube algorithm. Maybe. Who knows? Do what you want. But before we get started, if you haven't taken this free training already, make sure you take it. There's a link in this video and down below in the description and comments. There's going to be a lot of volatility in the markets heading into this election. And volatility becomes a problem when you don't have a good strategy and system in place. Because then you start getting shook out of positions and you start making mistakes and then your P&L gets hit. It sucks. But when you have a strategy in place, it's just so much better and so much easier. Way less stress. So definitely check out this free training where we explain our strategy, the one I use and most of our Fallible members use as well. But okay, let's get into it. So democracy in general functions best when there's a wide range of educated and opposing non-static viewpoints. So it's good having a bunch of people having different opinions. And the reason why, well, there's three reasons. First is because of the complexity of our system. So in a complex system like our economy and all these millions of people living together, society in general, well, the optimal path or outcome can't be known. And at best, it can only be vaguely conceptualized. So no one knows the right answer of exactly what we should be doing or where we should go as a society. All that complexity leads to unknowns. So to deal with these types of systems that we live in, we need iterative feedback loops. So to navigate the complex environments, we require continuous iteration and course redirection via feedback. There's no straight path to where we want to go. We got to course correct a lot. And it's the opposing forces that drive that self-correction. So in a crowd or hive system, like you could think of bees, opposing forces are required to maintain a kind of healthy equilibrium. So basically you want the wisdom of the crowd because no one person knows the answer. And also when we're talking about this, what you're going to see is that a lot of this analysis that we're doing about complex systems, obviously it applies directly to the stock market because the stock market is again an extremely complex system, just like the economy, just like society. So let's look at it in politics. So most of us can generally agree on where we want to go as a country, right? We're here and we want to get there. Now you can't exactly define where there is, but you got an idea, right? So you probably want strong economic growth, equal access to good education and healthcare, protection of our environment, civil liberties, rule of law, all that good stuff. But where we differ is how to actually get there. Now, like we said, there isn't some actual destination, it's just a general idea. It's pretty much a moving target. So when it comes to politics, Democrats might think that their way is the best way to get there. So that's this blue line right here. And then of course the Republicans think they have their own way of getting there, which is this red line. You can see these are very far apart, but both strongly believe those are the best paths to get to the same area, to the same solution. But what both parties miss is that the optimal path to actually get there is somewhere in the middle of the two opposing philosophies. So this right here, this middle line is the invisible optimal path. And that path isn't entirely visible to us. That's why it's invisible. And that's because the world and politics are complex, super complex, endlessly complex. No one person, group, ideology could possibly have a monopoly on the truth or the optimal path to there. Even though they might say they do, no, it's too complex, you can't know. So at the end of the day, it's our democratic system that allows for our diversity. And by allowing for that diversity, we trend to there over time, taking something closer to this optimal path. So democracy harnesses our collective wisdom, and as a result, we end up with better outcomes than what's seen in alternative forms of government. Shout out the CCP, which we'll talk about in a second. So here's another example of the wisdom of crowds, and this is from Scott Page's book, The Difference. So he was talking about the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So on the show, you know, if you can't answer a question, you're allowed a lifeline. And one lifeline is a call to a friend, another lifeline is poll the audience. So you would think the lifeline to call a friend, because they're usually calling an expert on whatever question they got if they don't know it, you would think that would be the most accurate responses. And actually the call a friend isn't bad, it proved correct 2/3 of the time. But what's surprising is that when you poll the audience predicts correctly 9 times out of 10. And that's way better than 2/3. And this is just an example of how great the wisdom of the crowd is. Mistakes cancel one another out, and correct answers like cream rise to the surface. That's what you get from a big diverse set of opinions, which is also why discussion and discourse is good if you're able to have it, which seems like we're not able to anymore. But we'll talk about that in a second too. So this superior emergent intelligence is seen all throughout nature, from ants and bees collectively identifying the shortest path to food or a new hive location to even buffalo selecting the quickest route over a mountain pass. It's simple, beautiful, and it's a messy process, listen. It's just part of nature. But most importantly, it's robust and extremely effective. So this whole process seems to be driven by the principle of least exertion. And that's kind of what we say in markets, right? The path of least resistance. Is it up or down? And somehow, even though it follows the principle of least exertion, it still creates a maximal structural stability. And this is just how evolution works. That's how we are where we are. So going back to politics again, we know if only one party were to win all the time and have their way, we'd end up way far away from where we want to go. So if Democrats had it, we'd be up here. Republicans, we'd be over here. But where we want to be is right here in the middle. So if one party won all the time, then we wouldn't receive the benefit of opposing opinions. There'd be no iterative self-correction or any harnessing of our superior collective intelligence. We got to be able to use that "who wants to be a millionaire" crowd. They are the most accurate. And this right here is actually what happens in authoritarian single-party countries like China. Over time, their system skews further and further away from the optimal place where they should be, and that increases fragility. That's why the CCP is destined to eventually fail, just like all the other top-down rigid political systems before them. Without opposing beliefs putting each other in check, there's no self-correction. And without self-correction, fragility rises. And eventually, the endless march of time forces a violent reversion. One of the mouthpieces of the CCP recently posted this on Twitter saying, "Oh, look at these ethnic minorities dancing. They could only be dancing if they were super happy." What do you say? Only happy and carefree people can dance so beautifully. And these are the same people that they're putting in the camps, that they're harvesting the organs from, that they're trying to completely remove their entire cultures. And that's your daily shot against the CCP. Those terrible, terrible people. But anyway, a well-functioning democracy looks something like this. So we're here, we got some Democrats, Republicans, eventually we get there. So we kind of move around the optimal path. And what does this look like if you follow Dalio? Kind of like debt cycles too. Everything in these complex systems from nature to markets, you kind of see the overlying trends where they all function the same way. From a broad macro perspective is what I'm saying. You see this sine wave all the time. And actually I skipped this part, but in the beginning of this note, Alex talks about the double helix formation and sine waves in markets and how this is just everywhere. There's these weird structures that form in nature for some reason. And you wonder, how did this thing get created? Like the double helix of our DNA. And then the same thing like we're talking about in our politics, society, markets, it's all the same structures. And it just goes back to kind of a law of the universe, if you really want to get macro about it. And that's what it goes back to what we said here about nature. It follows the principle of least exertion, but still somehow creates maximal structural stability. So we're getting real meta here, but that's what's interesting about macro research. And way more interesting than debating Trump versus Biden. So a healthy political environment follows a sine wave, as you've seen here. A sine is an acceleration opposite to your current position. It's the iterative self-correction that's needed to create stable, optimal systems. Up close, it looks random and incredibly inefficient, but actually it's the most efficient thing we could have. Like Nassim Taleb says, randomness isn't something to be tempered and held down, but rather harnessed. He said this is a central illusion in life, that randomness is risky, that it's a bad thing, and that eliminating randomness is done by eliminating randomness, which is just not true at all. Just like in the markets, you got to plan for that randomness. And that's actually another thing we talk about in the psychology training, which we give to all our members, which you'll learn more about in this training. But to be good in markets, you got to be able to sit with that randomness. And once you understand it and realize it's a part of the natural process, you feel a lot better about it and you don't get thrown out of positions and you're able to follow your system or strategy, which is so important. And that psychology training is important because the natural human instinct is to try and control for all the complexity instead of accepting it and moving with it. We all want to naturally manage chaos and eliminate variability. But as we discussed, this is impossible because we don't know exactly where it is we want to go, let alone the best path to get there. So Nassim Taleb again says that in a complex world, the notion of cause itself is suspect. It is either nearly impossible to detect or not really defined, which is another reason to ignore newspapers with their constant supply of causes of things. Basically what he's saying is a lot of stuff is just random. We can't find a cause for everything. And one of Alex's favorite lines ever is, "In turbulence is the preservation of the world. All this chaos is needed." Kevin Kelly's book, Out of Control, he wrote a paragraph describing this. He said, "A forest needs the severe destruction of hurricanes to blow down the old and make space for the new. The turbulence of fire on the prairie unloosens bound materials that cannot be loosened unless ignited. A world without lightning and fire becomes rigid. An ocean has the fire of undersea thermal vents in the short run and the fire of compressed seafloor and continental plates in the long geological run. Flash heat, volcanoes, lightning, wind, and waves all renew the material world. All that chaos is all part of the system. A certain level of randomness and variability exposes weaknesses and forces that self-correction. That's how evolution works. So it doesn't make sense to try and eliminate that. Over-optimization of complex systems creates stasis, death, while turbulence is a requisite for stability. It's also why we don't over-optimize our strategies, because what happens? Markets change. Well, they don't change, but they go through cycles over and over again, which can be very extended. If you have a strategy that's too overfit to one cycle, it's going to get blown out in the next cycle. So that's why even though you think you can increase your returns, and maybe you can, you might go for the lower returns this year so that the strategy survives each year after. You don't want to overfit it. So the paradox we got to face with all these complex systems is that stability comes from turbulence, and fragility is created when that turbulence is dampened. So you want another example? Look no further than all our central bankers trying to print our way out of every problem, lowering interest rates. You're trying to dampen the turbulence. You're not letting things self-correct. So what's going to happen? We're going to get a huge reversion one day, and it's going to be miserable. And once again, goes back to Dalio's debt cycles, right? Because this plays out again and again. People's natural condition is to try and control everything, and no politician wants anything bad happening under their watch, right? So you're going to print, and then you get that World War II, Great Depression era once every generation where everything resets. It sucks. So a couple of things we can take from this macro view of politics and society, markets, all that. One is that we could clearly see the pointlessness of all the bickering that happens in politics. Our strength actually comes from our differences of opinion, but our weaknesses come when both sides refuse to actively listen to one another, which is exactly what's happening now. I talked about this in the last video. No discussions happening, just arguments, and one side calling the other side basically evil. Stupid. Another thing is that this is just a better way to look at politics and policy. It's more of a macro view that lets you pull out, and you realize that the question of which party will win this election isn't that important. The important thing is the integrity of our institutions and our democratic process, because if we know we're going to keep rotating back and forth, and that's the optimal way to do things, then who cares about the next election? As long as the right things are in place with our institutions and democratic process. But it's here where the decades of gerrymandering and the politicalization of our judicial system becomes concerning, because they're screwing up how the process works. And there's also danger from those at the extremes who want to silence free speech and punish those with unpopular opinions. And now, as you saw in our last video, all of a sudden violence is getting acceptable if you don't get your way in politics. So those are the real problems, not who's going to win the next election. Another thing is understanding this really opens your mind, because when you understand how important it is to have differing opinions, you're forced to accept your own fallibility. What a familiar word, huh? And hopefully that allows you to disavow yourself from any single party or ideology. And we talked about this in the last video too. Putting yourself under a label just diminishes your critical judgment. Instead of thinking for yourself, you think, hey, what does my party say? Okay, that's what I believe too. It's stupid. It's pointless and detrimental to getting you closer to the truth, which is really what you should be after. Which is really what I always say a good discussion should be, is two people working together to get to the truth. But most discussions, because they're not actually discussions, they're arguments, are just one person trying to one up the other, which goes back to ego and everyone just trying to show off constantly because everyone's insecure. But I could make a whole nother video about that. If we accept our fallibility, then we naturally respect those on the other side of the aisle that have a different opinion, because we know that the right way is for both of us to be heard and go back and forth. These forces are what drive us forward, and it gives us a robust structure, allows us to spiral closer to there, where we all want to go. And lastly, a good heuristic is the middle way approach, useful for analyzing any complex argument when there's at least two reasoned opposing majority viewpoints. Because we know if collectively we're smarter than any one person or group, then you could split the difference between those two viewpoints, and you can say that the truth is likely somewhere in between. So how's that for an intro? A nice long intro, macro way to look at everything. But moving into the micro, it does look like Biden is going to be the next president. So leading up to the 2016 election, when we were writing about it at Macro Ops, we talked about how Trump was likely going to win. And everyone was saying he wasn't going to win, but from our point of view, it kind of looked like an easy bet. Because first of all, it's very rare for a party to keep the presidency for 3 consecutive terms. It's only happened once out of 7 opportunities since 1950. And there was also just something that Trump was capturing. He honed in on it and exploited it way better than the Hillary campaign. This is less true today. And more importantly, there's been a significant shift in the eligible voting population over the last 4 years. And it's one that greatly favors the Democratic Party. 2020 will be the last stand of the baby boomers. So this is the first poll in which voting will be dominated by generations younger than 40, especially millennials. So baby boomers have dominated politics since the early 90s when they became the largest living generation. But they lost that status in 2019, and now millennials are the largest living generation. So as of 2019, there's 72 million millennials aged 23 to 38, 500,000 more than the baby boomers. In this election, millennials and Gen Z will comprise almost 40% 40% of the electorate. That gives them a lot of power. And this shift in the voting population was pretty swift. In the 2010 midterms, boomers and older people outvoted younger generations almost 2-1. In 2014, the disparity remained. Boomers cast 57 million votes and younger voters 36. But 4 years later, in 2018, the three younger generations outvoted the older ones. Not by coincidence, the 2018 midterms were a blue wave and the Dems regained the House. So to win this time around, Trump would have to capture every swing state as well as a couple of decent-sized blue states. And that's going to be almost impossible. In 2016, Trump surprised a lot of people because the pollsters got it wrong. They glossed over a bunch of populist voters, but that's not going to happen this time. And as of June 30th, Trump had an approval rating of just 38%. Ned Davis research pointed out that no president has been reelected with an approval rating that low at the end of June. Truman was close at 39%, but no other president has been reelected with an approval rating below 47%. Trump's only chance to win is if something happens to Biden's health, or if he horribly stumbles in one of the remaining two debates, showing debilitating cognitive impairment. But it would have to be really bad because the expectations are already so low. But as long as that doesn't happen, it looks like Biden's going to win big in this upcoming election. But from a market perspective, are we going to get a crash from a Biden victory? No, the impact is probably going to be muted. Politics are given way too much weighting in regards to their impact to markets. It's just a result of people projecting their own political biases. This chart from NDR shows that the markets pretty much reverse after a Republican loses. In the post-election years, the market's just fine, and that'll probably happen again. Biden is a fairly centrist candidate, and similar to Trump, he and the Democrats want to spend a lot of money, which is great for the stock market. So we're going to have a report soon that's going to explain what's going to happen to prices. But like I said, even though the markets will likely continue to keep going up, there is going to be a lot of volatility. So make sure you have the right strategy in place. So if you haven't already, check out our free training where we go over our entire strategy. There's a link in this video and down below in the description and comments. Do that and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already so I could see you in the next video. Stay fallible out there. Bye.